Hey, you're watching HuffPost Live. I'm Marc, Lamont Hill. Police are, quote, going to be in SWAT gear and have AR-15s around their neck. If you're out walking, we're going to stop you and we're going to ask you why you're walking and check for your ID. This is part of a statement made by the chief of police in a tiny town in Arkansas known as Paragould. Just last week, this city has 24,000 people and it's arming its police. Is Paragould just playing into the national trend of increasingly militarizing police? Or is this a move that might make sense? Joining us right now to have this discussion in the Google Hangout is Parenti, who is a professor at the School for International Training and the author of 4 books, including Lockdown America. We're also joined by Dave Grimm, who's a sportscaster in Paragould. Radley Balko also joins us. He's a senior writer for the Huffington Post. And on the phone, we have Hitt, a former prosecutor now in private practice in Paragould. Mr. Hitt, I'm going to start with you. Tell me what's going on there, and tell me why this might make sense.
Well, I think you have to consider the context, not only of current events in our community, but also, I guess, the surrounding region and perhaps even the country. In our own community, we've seen a statistical increase in crime. There's been, it seems like, an influx of property crimes against not only people who are trying to protect vehicles and such as that, but also trying to protect their lives. We recently had a home invasion that resulted in a homicide against an elderly gentleman. Anytime in a community of this size and this temperament, you see that kind of violent attack, it really rattles the community, and rightfully so. But not only here, also in close proximity to us, we have several communities that have been shaken by violent crimes, particularly in Blyville, but also a lot of property crimes in Jonesboro. We've just had a rash of increased crimes, and of course the national news lately has been creating a great perception of increased violence. And so I think what we're seeing here is just an effort to be community-minded and responsive to some things that are going on in our community and our country.
Well, Mr. Hitt, I mean, I understand the crime, and I understand the reaction to crime, the need to react to crime. No one wants to sit idly by while people are being burglarized, vandalized, and such. But we're hearing pretty intense stuff coming out of the city, man. The mayor says they may not be doing anything but walking their dog, but they're going to have to prove it. You know, when you hear language like that, where people are going to be innocently walking down the street and be accosted almost by police, when you hear the idea of a small town having AR-15 rifles, when you hear about the type of images that are being projected, not from the outside in, but maybe from the inside out, it's pretty scary stuff.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. But I'll have to say this. When I was originally contacted by the local reporter about those comments, I doubted it right away. Not that I doubted the reporter so much as doubted that was quite accurate information. And I've taken upon myself, because I know these city officials. I mean, I have a high regard for them, count them as friends, and I've contacted them to discern whether the context was accurate, and they've assured me that no, these things were taken out of context, that certainly some of these quotes may be accurate to a degree, but were taken out of context, and that comforted me and went a long way, because I know these guys and I know our community, and I know that they're not really intending to create sort of a police state here. They're simply trying to be responsive to a perceived problem, and in fact, the mayor told me they are not going to be patrolling the streets in SWAT gear and trying to ID everyone. They made it clear that they're only trying to target areas of neighborhoods or areas of the community that are high crime areas, and only then when they're contacted by people who are perceiving probable criminal activity. And they want to be responsive to it, but at the same time, they don't want to scare people. I'm certainly cognizant of the fact that the way it came out and the way it was presented, it was pretty scary. I was alarmed by it. And I think they would admit that they would have been alarmed by it had they not known the context themselves.
All right. Well, Dave, you've heard the same stories coming out. How do you respond to them?
Well, I'll tell you, if the reports would have proven to be accurate, the initial reports, I would have had a major problem with the way it was being reported that they were going to conduct themselves. But it has since been revealed that that was not the case at all. They're not going to be arbitrarily asking folks for their ID just for any willy-nilly reason. They're going to have probable cause to do anything that they do, and they're not going to be, stormtrooping around with the weapons on them. Everything that was initially reported has proven to be now inaccurate. So if it were to have been accurate, I would have definitely had a problem with that. But the way it has been explained now, I'm cool with that. That's what needs to be done with the uptick in criminal activity that has been taking place here in Paragould.
All right. So when you say you're okay with what's going to happen, talk to me about what that actually looks like. I'm hearing what it's not going to be. Tell me what it will be. Tell me what measures will be taken.
They're going to have some foot patrol police officers during the time of night where most of the criminal activity is taking place. They said between the hours of 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. They're going to have some officers on foot. Now, in bigger cities, they have that anyway. That's something new to Paragould, but in this case, in the situation we're in right now, it would seem to be warranted.
All right, Radley, what do you say?
Well, I think there's a communication problem going on here. I mean, I don't know how some of the quotes that appeared in the original article could be taken or put in a context where they weren't frightening. I mean, it sort of seems to me that the police chief said some things that have since been walked back after they got some national attention. I mean, unless the reporter just flat out made them up, which is, I don't know the reporter. I would hope that's not the case. But, I mean, this is, I'm not sure, why, property crimes, I mean, it sounds to me like they're still going to respond to the reports of crime with the guns and with the SWAT gear. They're not going to sort of be patrolling the streets that way. But still, I mean, in any other place in the country, if you get reports of property crime, you send a squad car out and a cop in his traditional police blues. I'm not sure why it deserves this sort of heavy-handed response. But again, it's not entirely clear what is going to happen. They've said that the original reports were wrong, but they haven't quite said what it is that they're what kind of response a report of property crime is going to get. So it's kind of hard to react because it's still not clear what's going on. Just
to be clear, Corporal Brad Snyder made a comment to media in response, coming from Paragould Police, made a comment in response to this. He said, "We are well aware of Supreme Court cases that tell us what we can and cannot do. We won't go out there and do things we can't do." I think a lot of people have the misconception that these guys are going to be walking shoulder to shoulder down the middle of the street with rifles in hand, and that is completely false. They then tweeted something out that we picked up. It's from Paragould Tweets, and it says, "All the kooks that were tweeting BS about martial law in Paragould won't RT the truth because it isn't as sensational." Christian, Radley, you sound like you want to jump back in. The idea that
it's not as, I mean, unless the reporter actually made up those quotes, I mean, the sensationalism doesn't come from people taking things out of context. The sensationalism comes from what was actually said. So, that's great if they're not actually going to do that and they are changing the policy, but maybe we should talk to the reporter and figure out what exactly happened here, because I don't see how you put those quotes into a more benign context.
Well, I don't want to get too into the back and forth about whether it's true or not what was said. There is a reality in Paragould that we have to respond to and that we have to deal with. And even when we take out the most extreme, and let's call it sensational, just for argument's sake, let's say some of it was sensational, even if it's the Paragould Police Department's fault because they're sensationalizing, even if it's the mayor's fault for that comment that I read earlier, even if all that's true, they said it, but it's still, not the case now, there is a reality that nobody disputes. There are going to be police walking down the street in SWAT gear. There's going to be a militarized presence, a militarized image of police through the streets. And many of us, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I'm not even sure that we know that. I mean, I've also seen denials that they're actually going to be in the SWAT gear. I mean, if they are, that I think is a problem. I mean, there's the militarized, the sort of paramilitary teams, there's a legitimate function for them, and that's when you have an emergency situation where somebody presents an immediate threat to the community. But using them for routine patrols, which we should let Christian jump in here because he's actually, gone out with some of these SWAT patrol squads. But this is not sort of the image that we associate with a free society. This kind of gear and these kinds of weapons on routine patrol.
Yeah, and if I may jump in here, I don't know what the situation is in this town in Arkansas, but there is a larger situation in the country, which is that the use of SWAT teams has increased dramatically over the last 30 years. In the mid-1980s, we had about several thousand SWAT raids a year. Now it's about 50,000 SWAT call-outs a year in this country. And they're frequently doing this without warrants. They don't need warrants. There's these patrols. Fresno had what was called the Violent Crime Suppression Unit that for a number of years was patrolling the African-American neighborhoods, primarily of Fresno, in this fashion with long weapons and essentially trying to intimidate people. There's a recent case in Florida where a SWAT team was called out to administer administrative searches of barbershops under the sort of business regulation laws of Florida, and they ransacked and searched a number of African-American owned barbershops in the name of, legally under the cover of inspecting barbershops, but in the name of trying to find drugs. They arrested one person on drugs charges, and they arrested 37 people on practicing barbering without a license. And there's obviously no need for SWAT teams to be doing this, but they do this. And there's a deeper problem than just the specific civil rights violations that go along with these incidents, which is that American policing over the last generation has become increasingly militarized. And the way that has happened is through federal deployment of military hardware and aid to local police forces. Now, with these hand-me-down military weapons comes a whole ideology, a set of training, but also a worldview, a language, an outlook that treats the population as the enemy. And the core to civilian policing in a democracy, and civilian policing is one of the tenets of a democracy, is that the police should have the consent of the people, they should obey the law, and they should serve the people and not treat communities as war zones. And that's one of the key problems with SWAT technology, is that it introduces a whole kind of war mentality to what should really be about problem solving, keeping the peace. And another aspect, the technology that comes with this is pepper spray, et cetera, et cetera. And you see this practice again and again of these technologies are introduced for special cases. Pepper spray came in the late 90s, and it was the idea that you don't have to shoot people anymore now if you have pepper spray. Well, lo and behold, how do they use pepper spray? It's not to avoid shooting people, it's to avoid simply handling people and arresting them. And you get pepper spray being used on people in many, totally inappropriate ways. So you have this defining down of what the threshold of acceptable use of force is, and you see that all over the country with SWAT teams. Once a community gets a SWAT team, the federal government gives them free training, gives them free hand-me-down weapons, well, they got to find a reason to use them. And in using them, they also transform the nature of policing, and often in a way that doesn't make communities safer. A lot of little towns, like Brattleboro, Vermont, where I spend half of my time teaching, you talk to the older cops, they're really resentful about all the gear that the police department has. And as a result, the police never get out of their cars. They never walk around. It's good that there's going to be foot patrols in this town in Arkansas, but the whole package of gear, the military ethos, the language and training that goes with it is very, very problematic.
But Christian, help me understand why. There are people who will say you're in these places, particularly high crime areas, there needs to be a tougher response because crime has gotten tougher. Criminals have gotten tougher. We have to do something.
Crime rates have gone down. Crime has been dropping in the United States for the last 20 years. And it's actually kind of baffles criminologists. It's been dropping all across the industrialized West. And it's been dropping in cities and countries that have adopted tough policing, like New York City. It's also been dropping in places that did not adopt tough policing. It's been dropping in countries that had big crime spikes in the 70s and early 80s. It's also been dropping in countries that didn't have particularly big crime spikes or didn't have any crime spikes. And it's not really clear what's causing this. One main explanation is that the the proportion of young people in the population is one of the main explanations for when there's more crime, because young people in general are more willing to take risks. And in the 70s and 80s, there was a larger portion of young people in the population. There's a smaller cohort of young people now vis-a-vis the total, and crime rates have gone down. Another explanation is actually the relative liberation of women. That basically, the more men and women mix in public, the kind of more civilized a society becomes. But the fact is that crime rates are dropping, and this whole idea that there's an emergency that we need to deploy SWAT teams for, it's like, I don't think there's any new emergency. Crime is awful. There's too much of it, but it's actually dropping.
But what about weapons? It's about interaction with people. What about places where it's not? For example, in 2002, Paragould.
Yeah, are we still talking about Paragould, or what are we talking about?
Well, that's what I'm saying.
We're talking about the larger issue of SWAT teams in the country as well.
No. So there's two issues here. There's the question of Paragould, which I think is important, and then there's a broader issue of militarization. But I want to consider what happens in a place like Paragould, Christian, where in 2002 it was considered the safest city in America, and now they're seeing a spike in crime. And so their response to a spike in crime, which is indisputable, the crime is going up there, is to militarize the space. Tell me why it's a bad idea, where people do have spikes in crime, to respond with tougher police presence, with more visible presence of weapons, with more visible presence of tactical forces. Tell me why that's a bad idea.
It's a bad idea because these weapons then get misused, and it changes the relationship of the police to the community. It builds in hostility and mistrust, and it can lead to serious civil rights abuses. I mean, that example I gave you of raiding barbershops under an administrative warrant, is that really the kind of society we want to live in? Who knows whether they're actually doing the type of stop and frisk stuff that the mayor threatened or the chief of police originally threatened. But if they were, and police do that in many communities, that's not legal. That's not fair. That's not what the Fourth Amendment says is supposed to happen. So there's an erosion of basic civil rights.
Okay.
Can you defend civil rights and have a risk-free society? No. But civil rights are very important.
We have another comment from Corporal Brad Snyder with the Paragould Police Department, who said, "We cannot demand IDs. We can ask, but we can't demand." He then added that if people don't comply, then that's it, but we're going to be visible. Our uniforms, they're dark. They have patches on each shoulder and a small silver badge on the chest. But these guys that have SWAT vests, they've got police written on them as big as they can be on the front and back of those vests. So it's obvious that it says police, and it's obvious that the police officers are there. He also said that along with SWAT gear, they inform residents that officers might also carry AR-15s during their street crime unit patrols. Dave, if that's what is going on, actually, first, let me go to you, Curtis. If that's what's going on, if it's SWAT gear, police, the occasional AR-15 on their routes, does that still not create a level of militarization and a level of heightened security that might undermine peace, that might undermine democracy, that might undermine any sense of community that we have there?
Oh, you could argue that. I mean, it's arguable. I mean, the law of criminal procedure, police activity, is always a battleground between somewhat competing interests. On the one hand, you have citizens' rights. On the other hand, you have the interest of law and order, and those are sometimes competing interests. And where, in practice, to actually hammer it out on the street is always a question mark. But what you're seeing from city officials here is simply an effort to be responsive to perceived attacks against the peace and dignity of our community. What we're debating is
Curtis,
what we're going to do.
An uncharitable way to interpret that would be that this is political theater.
We can be responsive to it.
This is political theater.
We're bringing attention to what we think might happen, but I think once we actually see what happens, then we'll have something to talk about.
Well, I think people are concerned because, and this is something that when we look at studies in as recently as as far back as 1999, in places like San Francisco, you could add Fresno to the list and other urban areas, what you see is what some reporters and experts call an image of the West Bank. When they saw, the level of military technology, the number of soldier-looking police officers there, they said that it felt very much like an unsafe area. And there's a ton of sociological data to suggest that when people are in areas like that, they actually feel less safe, and crime actually has a possibility of going up. So in light of all that, I think part of what people are concerned with, Curtis, is whether or not this is a sensible strategy from the front end, much less what happens on the back end. Talk to me.
The picture that was painted originally, I think, is certainly disconcerting. I mean, it's troubling to me. I think it's more than troubling. I think it's alarming. I just don't think that's what's going to happen. I just don't see that happening here in our community. I've not seen it happen. I've talked to the officials. They've assured me that's not what they have in mind. In fact, some of the questions, or rather the quotes that were attributed, they've told me have been out of context. For instance, I think there was one quote to the effect, you might be walking your dog, but you're going to have to prove it. The mayor told me that he was looking at a friend of his when he said that with a half smile on his face, talking to him directly because it was one of his gentleman friends who walks his dog in the community. I'm not saying that the reporter was intentionally blowing things out of proportion or even making up things. I'm not saying that he was inaccurate, but I'm thinking that we're just getting a little carried away.
Yeah, but I'm ignoring it because I don't want that to become sort of the straw argument either. I mean, I fully concede that there might be many things out of context, but even the things that we know are true, the things that the city concedes are going to happen, those things are still somewhat problematic. Christian, you've been on police rides before in Fresno. You've been in areas where this stuff has happened. Is it common for the city to lay out an agenda like this and then pull back a little bit and say, oh, we didn't mean all of that, or pull back and say it's not going to be as bad as you think it will be in real practice?
Well, I think that this police chief is probably responding to the national pushback, the article in the Huffington Post. But more often, I mean, there are cases where this stuff gets walked back, like Fresno, the most famous case where for several years they patrolled regularly with, basically a platoon, their SWAT team with Heckler and Koch MP 54 assault rifles, the same weapons carried by the Navy SEALs. They patrolled. They had a armored personnel carrier, and this was just their routine method of patrol. And it led to some problems and some questionable shootings. And then the mayor, the next chief of police, suspended those patrols, as was mentioned in Bradley's article. But there's, no more often than not, they don't walk this back. More often than not, part of what SWAT and this heavy-handed policing is about political theater. Politicians love to respond to voters' fears, and voters have many legitimate fears, and a lot of them, particularly at the level of a small city, there's not that much a politician can do about changing the economy, really enhancing the life chances of people's children. So what they do is they whip up hysteria about crime, not that crime isn't a real issue, and then they respond not necessarily with effective policies, but with theatrics. So you get
the
rollout of long arms, a special name for the operation, et cetera, et cetera. And the city sees on the nightly news that the police are taking action. And politicians love it because they look like they're doing something. I think
there's a comment coming in right now. There's a comment coming in right now from D-Nell 10 who says something very similar. D-Nell says, I was just thinking this is theater, a show of force to make people feel better. Dave, when you think about what the city needs, you said that you're okay with certain requests, like an ID check, as long as people aren't forced to do it. Or as long as there's probable cause, you said. So if that's the case, at what point do we go over the line? You're okay with an ID check, but are you okay with the tactical gear? Are you okay with weapons at all? Are you okay with, where do you draw the line to stop people from getting their cars broken into? At some point, it just seems excessive.
Well, first of all, I want to point out that it's not just been cars being broken into or homes. There was a home invasion just a couple of weeks ago in this town where somebody broke into a house, killed the guy in the house, and left with his stuff. It's a little bit more violent than just breaking into cars. Another thing I want to disagree with is that this is some sort of a theatrical performance by our police chief and or our mayor. These are real concerns. They're real figures, real criminal figures that have gone up in our town that need to be responded to. It's not somebody responding just because they feel like it would gain them political points. We want them to respond to the rise in criminal activity in our town.
But the question is this the appropriate response?
Well, that's the question.
What you just described, it sounds like there needs to be a good investigation of this home invasion. What's going on there?
That's my understanding.
Problems are generally better solved by detectives who investigate, who have good, close working relationships with the community. Those kinds of relationships between police forces and communities are frequently disrupted by the kind of the SWAT theatrics. And what you're describing doesn't sound like a problem that nightly SWAT patrols would solve.
It is my understanding that the gear, the equipment that we're talking about here is something that remains in the trunks of these police cars at all times anyway. It's standard operating procedure for them to have them in these cars, and it has been for a long time.
But now they wouldn't be in the cars, right? Just to be clear, they wouldn't be in the cars now. People, they walk the streets with them at times.
In some cases, they're going to be in use, visible, I believe, from what we're understanding. But it's something that they have with them at all times anyway.
No, but I think the question isn't just about the possession of military weapons in general. It's the show of it, it's the presentation of it, and how it might affect the community relations. If you're having break-ins, if you're having home invasions, if you're having violent crimes, deep investigation, community-based policing, these are things that we know work. Having quick responses to 911 calls, these things all statistically improve people's chances of getting crime solved, and they actually prevent crime from the front end. I'm not sure that we see the evidence that looking like Gaza will make...
I think that's an over-exaggeration. It's not going to look like Gaza. They're going to just increase the number of police they have in the affected area, and it is a specific area of this town that the criminal figures have gone up. It's a very specific area of the town, and they're also going to be opening up another police station, a second police station in that area of town as well, so that will slow down response time to calls that come in. So, I mean, it's just concentrating on an area that needs to be concentrated on. I don't think there is really going to be that much difference, except that there's going to be more of them in that area.
We have a comment coming in from Comrade Yuri, who says, I already feel uncomfortable calling the police in my city because they are infamous for using excessive force. If they gave those police officers military gear, I would walk the other way when I saw them in fear of getting shot for, quote, looking suspicious. Radley.
See, that guy's not describing Paragould. He's describing some big city somewhere where there is a lot of crime all the time, all over the town. This is a town of 26,000 people.
Congratulations to Paragould. That's good. But there is a larger issue, which is militarization of police in the U.S. And there was a case in Arizona of an Iraq war vet, 2 tours in Iraq, and a SWAT team showed up and shot him dead because they were serving a drug warrant. There was a case in White Plains, New York last year of another veteran, 64-year-old African-American man whose medical alert thing went off by mistake. And they sent the police. He said, I'm fine. It was a mistake. I don't want the police to come into my house. And the police hyped up on this military, ethos, ended up breaking into his house and killing him. So
would you rather they not show up at all? Would you rather they not be there when you need them? I mean,
I would rather that the police did not have these military weapons. And I think that particularly in a lot of small towns, things would be safer if the police got out of their cars, walked around, didn't think they were soldiers, but got to know people. In a lot of small towns,
you're
describing a town that's about the size of Brattleboro, Vermont. And it's very clear if the police in those kinds of towns generally just got out of their cars, got to know people, they'd find out, what the situation was. This whole idea that repression and technology and military theatrics are going to solve the problem, I really questioned it.
And I'm telling you that I don't think that's the case here.
I'm sorry, Dad, I didn't mean to cut you up, but I'm going to give Radley the last word here.
Okay.
Look, I think there are 2 discussions going on here. We're not really sure what's going on in Arkansas or what's going to go on, which I think is part of the problem there. But, with the larger issue that Christian is talking about, I mean, I think the problem is, when SWAT teams were started, they were started as these sort of emergency responses to, riots and ongoing shootings and bank robberies and that sort of thing. And what we've seen as they've spread across the country and they spread to smaller and smaller towns is that the sort of threshold that you need to meet before you get one of these responses is getting lighter and lighter, and the crimes are getting more and more petty. So now that, SWAT teams are routinely used to serve pot warrants, for example, and the idea that you need this kind of force to send this kind of force for a consensual crime, for barbering without a license, for example, that is, I think, what's alarming and what people like Christian and I are concerned about. And this idea now of now using this gear and cops dressed in this kind of equipment for routine patrols is even more frightening. I mean, this is not, these aren't the sorts of images that we typically associate with a free society. But whether or not that's going on in Arkansas, I guess we'll have to wait and see, because there seems to be a lot of mixed messages coming out of there.
But Radley, is it an inevitably slippery slope? Once you start down this road, do you always end up?
Well, this is true. I mean, this is true of most government agencies. They get mission creep, right? You want to justify your budget. You want to get more money. If you want to stick around while crime is dropping, violent crime is dropping, then you need to justify your existence. And you need to, and there's also, they're getting federal grants for doing drug raids, and they don't get federal grants for, raiding murder suspects. So there's a lot of bad incentives going on too. But no, I think it is inevitable, because there's the old saying that when you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And I think when you have a SWAT team, you start to think that every offense is a SWAT-worthy offense.
Wow. Well put, sir. Christian, Dave, Radley, Curtis, thank you so much for spending some time with us here. We appreciate your insights. Stay here with us at HuffPost Live. Abby Huntsman is up next.